Hey everyone, and welcome back to Hacker News Daily. I'm your host, and today we're diving into yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. 5 fascinating discussions selected from the 30 most active posts on the platform. We've got quite a range today, from the future of social media and how open protocols might finally break the stranglehold of big tech, to new hardware from Raspberry Pi, a controversial UK digital ID proposal, and some really thoughtful discussions about managing complexity in our increasingly chaotic tech world. These stories pulled in thousands of comments combined, and I think you'll see why. Let's kick things off with what might be the most important technological shift happening right under our noses. But here's where the discussion gets really interesting, because the Hacker News community is having this collective wait a minute moment about AT protocol versus ActivityPub, the protocol that powers Mastodon. A lot of folks are admitting they initially dismissed AT protocol as just another corporate attempt at federation. But they're starting to see some real advantages. The data portability, the way identities work, the fact that you can have multiple apps all working with the same underlying data. One commenter put it perfectly. They said they came in skeptical, but left thinking AT protocol might actually be the better technical solution. And that's not a small thing in this community, where ActivityPub has had such strong support. But, and this is a big but, there are some serious concerns bubbling up. The elephant in the room is that despite all this talk about decentralization and openness, something like 99.99% of AT protocol users are on Blue Sky's own instance. That's not exactly the distributed utopia we're talking about here. People are worried about what they're calling a potential rug pull, where Blue Sky could theoretically change the rules once they've captured enough of the market. And then there's this really thoughtful counterpoint from one commenter who's basically asking, do we even need this? They're suggesting that maybe the peak of the internet was just websites, personal websites, forums like Hacker News for discussions, and that's it. No global conversation platform, no universal social graph. It's almost nostalgic in a way, but they have a point about whether we're solving a real problem or just creating new ones. The privacy angle is fascinating too. One user raised this concern that actually made me pause. They said, having every random site able to access your social data sounds like an absolute nightmare. And yeah, when you put it that way, the openness that makes these protocols powerful could also be what makes them dangerous. What really strikes me about this whole discussion is the chicken and egg problem that keeps coming up. Every Twitter alternative, whether it's Mastodon, Blue Sky, Threads, whatever, they all face the same fundamental issue. People go where people are. Content creators follow audiences, audiences follow content. It's this endless loop that makes displacing incumbents incredibly difficult, even when you have technically superior solutions. The comparison to open source is compelling, though. I mean, nobody in 1995 would have predicted that Microsoft would eventually embrace Linux, or that practically every major tech company would be built on open source foundations. The author's point is that these shifts happen slowly, then suddenly. And maybe, just maybe, we're at that inflection point with social media right now. The timing feels right, doesn't it? Between Twitter's chaos, Meta's various controversies, TikTok's regulatory challenges, users are more aware than ever of the problems with centralized platforms. Whether that translates into actual adoption of open protocols, well, that's the billion-dollar question. Speaking of trying to make sense of chaos and complexity, which, let's face it, is exactly what we're dealing with in the social media landscape, our next story tackles this problem head-on from a completely different angle. So here's something that really caught my eye on Hacker News today: How to Make Sense of Any Mess by Abby Covert. This one pulled in over 400 points and sparked some fascinating debate about how we organize information in our increasingly chaotic tech world. You know what's interesting about this book? It takes information architecture, something we usually think of as this very technical, very specialized field, and basically says, hey, everyone's doing this whether they realize it or not. And honestly, that's kind of brilliant when you think about it. Every time you organize your files, structure a database, or even just arrange apps on your phone screen, you're architecting information. You're taking a mess and trying to make it make sense. Covert's approach here is refreshingly philosophical. She's not just throwing frameworks and methodologies at you. She's starting with this fundamental idea that messes are made of both information and people. That's actually huge, right? Because how many times have we seen technically perfect systems fail because they didn't account for the human element? The book emphasizes why before how, which feels like the exact opposite of what we often do in tech. We love jumping straight to solutions, to tools, to implementation. But she's saying, slow down, understand the problem first. One thing that really resonated with the Hacker News crowd was her assertion that good is in the eye of the beholder. There's this whole section about looking good versus being good. And man, that hits different when you think about all the beautiful modern interfaces we've built that are actually terrible to use. Or the opposite, those ugly but incredibly functional internal tools that companies rely on for decades. The discussion thread itself turned into this amazing collection of war stories from the trenches. You've got people from thin tech, enterprise architecture, software development, all chiming in with their own experiences of organizational chaos. One commenter made this really sharp observation about documentation, or rather the lack of it. They pointed out that the most critical processes in organizations often go completely undocumented. Nobody knows what actually needs fixing because nobody wrote down how it's supposed to work in the first place. And then there's this fascinating debate about whether some messes are actually necessary. One person brought up the garbage can model, this organizational theory that says companies need their garbage dumps and scapegoat departments. It sounds cynical, but think about it. Every organization has that one department where all the weird, undefined tasks end up. Maybe that's not a bug. Maybe it's a feature. But here's where it gets spicy. An enterprise architect jumps in talking about their complex and ever-changing information landscape, and another commenter just demolishes them. Says basically, you know what? A lot of this complexity is self-inflicted. They're calling out the tendency to overcomplicate things with hexagonal architecture, microservices, Kubernetes, all these technologies that are supposed to manage complexity, but often just add more layers to it. It's like, we create the mess, then we need a book to help us make sense of the mess we created. The interconnected nature of these messes is another huge theme. Multiple people shared stories about systems where you can't fix one thing without breaking 3 others. It's this cascading complexity where every solution creates new problems. Someone mentioned using dependency graphs to visualize these relationships, and honestly, that sounds both incredibly useful and absolutely terrifying. Imagine seeing all your technical debt mapped out in a single diagram. What I love about this whole discussion is that it validates something we all know but don't always admit. Organizing information is hard. It's not just about choosing the right database or the perfect folder structure. It's about understanding the context, the users, the goals, and yes, the politics of the situation. Covert's book seems to give people permission to acknowledge that complexity instead of pretending it doesn't exist. The variety of frameworks people brought up in the comments is pretty wild, too. You've got SOS from pilot decision-making, OODA loops from military strategy, dependency graphs from computer science. It's like everyone's grabbing tools from different disciplines to try to tackle the same fundamental problem. And maybe that's the point. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to making sense of a mess. You know what really strikes me? This book is essentially about information architecture, but the discussion it sparked goes way beyond that. People are talking about organizational dynamics, human psychology, systems thinking. It's touching on this universal challenge we all face in tech. How do we create order without creating rigidity? How do we simplify without oversimplifying? These aren't just technical questions. They're almost philosophical ones. And that distinction Corbett makes between information, data, and content, that's not just semantic nitpicking. Understanding that information is architected to serve different needs, that changes how you approach every project. It's not just about storing data or displaying content, it's about creating meaningful structures that actually help people accomplish things. Now, speaking of trying to make sense of complexity and build better systems, let's shift to something more concrete. Actual hardware and software that people are building right now. We've got two interesting product releases that show very different approaches to solving user problems. All right, shifting gears here to something that's got the Hacker News crowd pretty fired up. The Raspberry Pi 500 Plus just dropped, and wow, is there some spirited debate happening around this one. So Raspberry Pi has basically taken their Pi 5 and crammed it into a keyboard, creating this all-in-one computer that's selling for $200. And that price point is where things get really interesting. You know, the concept itself is actually pretty clever. If you're familiar with the Raspberry Pi ecosystem, you've probably dealt with the whole mess of cables, dongles, and that perpetually flaky SD card situation. Well, the 500 Plus addresses at least one of those pain points beautifully. They've built in M.2 NVMe storage right into the thing. That's actually huge. No more corrupted SD cards, no more worrying about whether your storage is going to hold up under actual desktop use. It's one of those improvements that makes you wonder why it took this long.
But here's where the community really starts to split. At $200, you're entering territory where you can grab a refurbished mini PC with an Intel N150 processor, and those things will absolutely smoke a Pi 5 in terms of raw performance. We're talking full-size HDMI ports, x86 compatibility so you can run basically anything, and often for less money. One commenter pointed out you can get these NUC-style machines that'll VESA mount right to the back of your monitor, giving you that clean desk aesthetic without having your computer literally be your keyboard. The defenders of the Pi 500 Plus, though, they've got some legitimate points. There's this one user who's been daily driving a Pi 4 as their main desktop. Yeah, you heard that right, their main machine. And they're planning to upgrade to this. Their reasoning? Dead silent operation, practically zero energy consumption, and they actually love the form factor. They're not rendering video or compiling massive code bases. They're browsing, writing, doing normal computer stuff. And for that, the Pi is perfectly adequate. What's fascinating is how this product seems to tap into two completely different mindsets. There's the pragmatic crowd going, why would I pay $200 for something slower than a $100 used ThinkPad? And then there's this other group that sees something almost nostalgic here. The keyboard computer form factor, it's very Commodore 64, very BBC Micro. There's something appealingly simple about having your entire computer in one solid unit that just needs power and a display. The mechanical keyboard inclusion is interesting too, though funny enough, one commenter said they actually prefer chiclet keyboards, which that's definitely swimming against the current in enthusiast circles. But it shows how personal these preferences really are. I think what's really happening here is Raspberry Pi is trying to bridge two worlds. They want to maintain their educational, tinkerer-friendly roots while also creating something that could legitimately be someone's daily driver. And at $200, look, it's not cheap for what you get in pure specs, but it's also not expensive enough to be completely dismissed. It's sitting in this weird middle ground where it's too pricey for impulse educational purchases, but maybe not quite powerful enough for serious desktop replacement. The M.2 storage really is the killer feature here, though. That single improvement transforms this from a toy into something you could actually rely on day to day. No more, oh, my Pi corrupted its SD card again, horror stories. That alone might be worth the price of admission for some folks. And speaking of building new computing experiences from the ground up, that brings us to another ambitious project that's been years in the making. All right, moving on to our next story. Pop! OS 24.04 LTS Beta is finally here. And wow, the community has some feelings about this one. This release pulled in 390 points and over 200 comments on Hacker News. And I can see why, because this release is complicated in ways that really highlight the challenges of building a Linux distribution in 2024. So here's the deal.
System 76, the company behind Pop! OS, has been working on something pretty ambitious. They're not just updating their distro, they're building an entirely new desktop environment called Cosmic, written from scratch in Rust. And when I say from scratch, I mean they looked at GNOME, they looked at KDE, and they said, you know what, we can do this better. That takes some serious confidence. Now, the features they're promising with Cosmic are genuinely exciting. Independent workspaces per monitor. Finally, if you've ever used multiple monitors with Linux, you know this has been a pain point forever. They're also putting a top bar on every screen, which sounds simple, but it's one of those quality of life improvements that makes you wonder why it took so long for someone to do it. Users who've been testing the alpha are calling it a breath of fresh air and reporting that it feels incredibly snappy compared to GNOME. But here's where things get messy. This release is called Pop! OS 24.04, which in Ubuntu land typically means April 2024, except we're looking at a September 2025 release date for the stable version. That's over a year late. And the community is torn between excitement for what's coming and frustration about how long it's taking. I've been reading through these comments and you can feel the tension. There are users who've been stuck on Pop! OS 22.04 for years now, dealing with unfixed bugs because System 76 has basically put all their resources into this new Cosmic DE. One commenter mentioned they finally gave up and switched to Ubuntu after waiting and waiting. And honestly, I get it. When you're using something as fundamental as your operating system daily, you need stability and updates. The technical achievement here is impressive, though. Building a desktop environment is no joke. It's not just about drawing windows on screen. You need a compositor, a panel, a dock, a settings app, window management, all the accessibility features, integration with thousands of applications. And System 76 is doing this with a relatively small team compared to the armies working on GNOME or KDE.
What's interesting is seeing the different philosophies at play here. One user brought up an alternative approach, pointing to projects like Hyperland and the Omarchy ecosystem, where instead of building one monolithic desktop environment, they're creating scriptable, highly customizable components that users can mix and match. That project apparently has way more community contributions, which makes sense. It's easier for developers to contribute to smaller, focused pieces than to understand an entire desktop environment codebase. But System 76 is betting on a different vision. They want that Apple-like integration where everything just works together seamlessly. And from what early testers are saying, they might actually be pulling it off. The performance improvements people are reporting aren't just marginal. We're talking about users saying it feels fundamentally more responsive than what they were using before. The question is, can they sustain this? Building a DE is one thing. Maintaining it for years as the Linux ecosystem evolves around you is another challenge entirely. They'll need to keep up with Wayland protocol changes, new hardware support, accessibility standards, security updates. It's a massive ongoing commitment. What strikes me about this whole situation is that it really shows the state of desktop Linux right now. Users are so hungry for innovation in this space that they're willing to wait over a year for a release, deal with alpha software, and passionately debate the merits of different approaches in 200+ comment threads. That's dedication, but it also shows the frustration. GNOME removing features with each release, KDE being, well, KDE with all its complexity, and users just wanting something that works well for actual productivity. I think System 76 is taking a huge risk here, but it might be exactly what the Linux desktop needs. Someone willing to rethink the fundamentals instead of just iterating on what exists. Whether they can deliver on that promise, well, we'll find out in September 2025 apparently. Though at this rate, who knows if that date will stick either. Now, from companies trying to build better, more open systems, let's talk about something that's got the tech community worried about moving in exactly the opposite direction. All right, so our final story has the Hacker News community pretty fired up. Britain is planning to introduce compulsory digital ID for workers. And wow, with nearly 650 comments, people have some strong opinions about this one. So here's what's happening.
The UK government is proposing a mandatory digital ID system that they claim will help combat illegal immigration and unauthorized working. But if you dig into the discussion, there's this overwhelming sense of, yeah, we've heard this before from the community. And honestly, the skepticism makes a lot of sense when you look at the UK's track record. See, what's fascinating about this discussion is how it reveals this deep distrust between tech-savvy citizens and government digital initiatives. One commenter pointed out something that really stuck with me. The UK already has the Investigatory Powers Act, what people call the Snoopers Charter. They've pushed for encryption backdoors, they have one of the most extensive CCTV networks in the world, and now they want to add mandatory digital IDs to that mix. You can understand why people are nervous. The technical implementation concerns are really interesting too. Multiple people brought up this point about smartphone dependency that I hadn't really considered. If this digital ID lives on your phone, which, let's be honest, it probably will, you're essentially forcing every worker in Britain to own a smartphone, probably running iOS or Android. One commenter called it out perfectly. They said this creates a situation where you literally cannot participate in society without carrying a device that tracks your location, requires regular updates, and runs proprietary software from Apple or Google. That's actually kind of dystopian when you think about it. And then there's the elephant in the room. Will this even work for its stated purpose? The consensus in the comments is a resounding probably not. Here's the thing. Illegal workers are typically paid cash, off the books. They're not going through formal employment processes where you'd check a digital ID anyway. The UK already has right-to-work checks. Employers are already supposed to verify people's immigration status. Adding a digital layer doesn't suddenly make cash-in-hand construction work disappear. One commenter made this really sharp observation. They said the government is essentially admitting they can't enforce existing laws, so their solution is to create new laws that inconvenience everyone. It's like, if you can't catch people working illegally now, how does making legal workers scan their phones change anything?
But here's where it gets really interesting. There was this one contrarian voice in the discussion. A user named EinarFD pointed out that countries with the best digital government services, places like Estonia and the Nordic countries, they all have digital ID systems, and these work really well. The argument is that maybe, just maybe, this could be the foundation for actually improving the UK's notoriously clunky government digital services. Though, even that optimistic take comes with a huge caveat. Those successful implementations happen in countries with strong privacy protections and high trust in government institutions. The UK, well, let's just say the comment section suggests that trust isn't exactly overflowing right now. There's also this whole angle about whether illegal immigration is even the problem the government claims it is. One commenter pointed out something pretty ironic. The NHS is chronically underfunded and relies heavily on immigrant workers. So you're simultaneously saying immigration is this huge problem while your healthcare system would collapse without immigrants. It's a bit contradictory, isn't it? What really comes through in this discussion is this sense of mission creep that people are worried about. Sure, today it's just for employment verification. But once you have this infrastructure in place, once every worker has a mandatory digital ID, what's to stop it from expanding? One day it's for work, the next it's for healthcare, then banking, then maybe you need to scan it to enter certain buildings or use public transport. The infrastructure for total surveillance becomes trivially easy to implement. And you know what's kind of telling? In nearly 650 comments, I couldn't find many people genuinely excited about this. Even the most charitable interpretations were basically, well, if implemented perfectly with strong safeguards, maybe it won't be terrible. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement for a major government initiative. The whole thing really highlights this fundamental tension we're seeing more and more. Governments want to digitize and centralize for efficiency and control, while citizens who understand the technology are increasingly aware of just how much power that hands over.
It's playing out in real time in Britain. And based on this discussion, the tech community is not buying what the government is selling.
And that's a wrap on yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. What a fascinating mix, right? We started with the promise of open social protocols potentially revolutionizing how we interact online, explored how to make sense of the complex systems we're building, looked at new hardware and software trying to solve real user problems, and ended with concerns about government overreach in the digital age. What really strikes me about today's selection is this recurring theme of control and complexity. Whether it's who controls our social graphs, how we manage information chaos, what computing platforms we choose, or how governments track their citizens, these aren't just technical questions anymore. They're fundamental questions about how we want to live in an increasingly digital world. The Hacker News community's response to these stories, thousands of comments, passionate debates, technical deep dives, shows that these issues really matter to people who understand the technology. And maybe that's the most important takeaway. The people building tomorrow's tech are deeply engaged with not just how things work, but how they should work. Thanks for joining me for this dive into yesterday's top Hacker News stories. If you enjoyed this discussion, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time with more of the best conversations from the tech community. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and keep pushing for better solutions to the problems that matter. This has been Hacker News Daily. I'm your host, and we'll see you tomorrow.